"Excuse me, waiter, but I think there's been a mistake." Karen's voice sliced through the ambient hum of the restaurant, loud enough for anyone within earshot to hear. Her eyes shot to David, sitting a few tables away. She didn't know him, didn't care to, but something about his presence unsettled her. David, calmly scrolling through his phone, didn't lift his head. He could feel the eyes on him, hear the murmurs, but this wasn't new. People stared all the time, especially in places like this, fancy, exclusive, places where black men weren't expected to dine alone. Karen huffed, clearly annoyed by the waiter's response. "He can't possibly afford to eat here," she muttered, not bothering to lower her voice. David smiled to himself. He'd dealt with worse. After a few minutes, Karen called for the check, swiping her card with the casual confidence of someone who'd never worried about finances. But when the waiter returned with a frown, murmuring that her card was declined, Karen's face turned beet red. David glanced up briefly, just in time to catch her expression, a mix of fury and humiliation. Without a word, he called the waiter over, handed him his own card, and simply said, "I've got her." The room fell silent. Karen, still processing the shock, stood frozen as the waiter relayed the message. Her eyes darted to David, wide with disbelief. Why would he pay for me? She wondered, her throat tightening. But before she could say a word, David was already gone, leaving her to wrestle with her confusion. Karen sat frozen in her chair, her thoughts racing. The embarrassment from the declined card still burned hot on her cheeks, but the confusion about David's gesture gnawed at her more. She had always believed that people like him were out of place in the high-end world she inhabited. Yet, not only was he comfortable there, he was generous. Her fingers trembled as she signed the bill, eyes glancing nervously at the waitstaff, all of whom avoided eye contact. She felt their judgment, but worse, she felt something she rarely experienced: guilt. She had insulted him, mocked his presence, and yet he had done the unthinkable, paid for her meal without a word of condescension. Back in the safety of her luxury car, she sat for a moment, replaying the entire interaction. Why didn't he say anything? Why didn't he throw it in my face? The questions hung in the air. The silence in her car felt oppressive, suffocating, almost as if her entire world had shifted. That night, she tried to distract herself by scrolling through social media, yet nothing could pull her attention away from the burning sensation of the day's events. She started typing, opening a search bar, and then, impulsively, she typed his name. Days passed, and Karen couldn't shake the feeling. Her routine, filled with brunches, high-end shopping, and client meetings, felt dull, as though something in her world had lost its shine. She hadn't realized how much her perception of control defined her life until David's act of kindness shattered it. She had been raised to believe certain things about people, to assume superiority over those she deemed beneath her, whether they were less wealthy, less connected, or, as she now realized, of a different race. But David's quiet dignity challenged that deeply. Curiosity overtook her disdain. She couldn't stop herself from learning more about him. What she found made her uncomfortable at first. David was far from what she had assumed. He was a well-known philanthropist, a self-made businessman with a reputation for using his success to help others. The more she read, the more it challenged her worldview. Why would someone like him help someone like me? She clicked on an article about his work with disadvantaged youth, his donations to charities supporting inner-city education, and his involvement with social justice organizations. Karen felt her stomach turn with a mix of admiration and jealousy. Why did someone like him have so much integrity? And why had it taken her so long to see beyond her preconceived notions? Her thoughts were interrupted by a notification on her phone, a reminder of a gala that weekend. She hesitated before checking the guest list. David was attending. She had no idea what she'd say if they crossed paths again, but something inside her, something unfamiliar, wanted to find out. The night of the gala arrived, and Karen felt a nervous energy she hadn't expected. Her usual confidence felt like a fragile mask that could crack with the slightest pressure. She knew she would see David, and that thought consumed her more than the event itself. Upon entering the lavish venue, Karen immediately scanned the room. When her eyes landed on David, he was deep in conversation, surrounded by influential figures. She noted how comfortable he seemed, how effortlessly he commanded the attention of everyone around him. It was disarming. Karen spent most of the evening avoiding him, unsure of what to say if their paths crossed. But fate had other plans. As she made her way to the exit, she accidentally bumped into a server, spilling wine across her dress. Mortified, she rushed toward the restroom, but before she could slip away, David approached. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice calm, his expression concerned. Karen froze. This was the moment she'd been dreading. She nodded quickly, barely meeting his gaze, and muttered a quick, "I'm fine, thank you." But the words felt hollow. David, sensing her discomfort, offered a small smile. "You don't need to feel embarrassed. It happens to everyone." Karen looked at him, expecting sarcasm or judgment, but found none. His kindness was disarming, and for a brief moment the carefully built walls around her prejudices began to crack. "Thank you for the other day, at the restaurant," she blurted, the words coming out more awkwardly than she had intended. David merely nodded, his expression unreadable. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said simply, and then, with a slight nod, walked away, leaving Karen standing in the middle of the room, grappling with a mix of emotions she wasn't sure how to process. Karen spent the next week lost in her thoughts. David's calm demeanor, his ability to forgive and move on, and his refusal to throw her behavior back in her face all weighed heavily on her. She realized, to her discomfort, that she admired him, and that made her uncomfortable because it shattered the version of herself she had always believed in. At her next business luncheon, Karen found herself seated beside a woman from her social circle who casually threw around derogatory comments, much like Karen herself had done in the past. But something in Karen had changed. She winced at the woman's words, feeling a deep sense of discomfort. For the first time, Karen spoke up, quietly but firmly. "You know, I don't think it's fair to make assumptions about people based on where they come from or what they look like." The woman looked at her, stunned. "Since when did you get all righteous?" she sneered. Karen shrugged, realizing this was her first step toward change, though it was much harder than she had anticipated. Inside, she felt a small sense of pride, but it was mixed with fear of how her social circle would react. That night, she went home, poured herself a glass of wine, and stared out the window, wondering where this path of transformation would lead. She couldn't go back to the person she was before, but she wasn't sure she was ready for what lay ahead either. The weeks that followed were a blur for Karen. Her once predictable and privileged life felt as though it was slipping out of control. She had always thought of herself as untouchable, her family connections, wealth, and status giving her a sense of invincibility. But cracks were beginning to show. A major business deal she had been working on for months fell apart. Her colleagues and clients, sensing her recent unease and distracted nature, began pulling away. Even her closest friends in her social circle seemed distant, confused by her sudden change in demeanor. One night, while Karen was preparing for bed, her phone buzzed. It was an email from her company's legal department. A lawsuit had been filed against her for breaching contract terms on a business deal. Panic set in. Her career, her reputation, everything she had worked for, was suddenly at risk. She spent hours on the phone with lawyers, but nothing could calm the storm brewing within her. As she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, she thought back to David. She remembered how calm he had been in the restaurant, and how, despite her blatant disrespect, he had shown her nothing but grace. That thought gnawed at her as she faced her own crisis. The next day, feeling completely overwhelmed, Karen made a decision that surprised even herself. She called David. The phone rang twice before his calm voice answered. "David speaking." Karen hesitated for a moment. "What am I even doing?" she thought, but then she took a deep breath. "Hi, David. It's Karen. From the restaurant. I need help." There was a pause on the other end of the line, but to her surprise, David's voice remained as calm as ever. "What can I do for you?" he asked, without a hint of judgment. Karen found herself sitting in David's office the next day. The sleek, modern space was a testament to his success, but what struck Karen the most was how humble and approachable David remained, even in his success. He didn't lord his achievements over her. In fact, he barely mentioned them at all. David listened patiently as Karen explained her situation, the lawsuit, her plummeting career, and the mounting pressure from her peers. She was half expecting him to remind her of how she had treated him, or to offer some smug satisfaction in her downfall. But he did none of that. Instead, he offered sound advice, suggesting strategies to navigate the legal trouble and even connecting her with his own legal team to help her out. As Karen sat across from him, her pride felt shattered. The shame of needing help from someone she had once insulted was almost unbearable, but David's kindness made it easier. It was humbling in a way she had never experienced before. He didn't make her feel small or insignificant. Instead, his support lifted her, making her feel as though redemption was possible. Karen left his office with a sense of hope she hadn't felt in weeks. But as soon as she stepped outside, the gravity of her situation hit her again. Could she really change? Could she let go of everything she had been taught and everything she had built her identity around? Karen's transformation didn't happen overnight, but each small step made a difference. She took David's advice seriously and started working on herself, not just professionally, but personally. She began attending events where she could meet people from all walks of life, community outreach programs, charity fundraisers, and social justice talks. Each event chipped away at the biases she had held for so long. But not everyone was supportive. Her former social circle ostracized her, whispering behind her back, mocking her for trying to change. They called her insincere, a fraud, and a traitor to her class. These interactions stung, but Karen was resolute in her path. The biggest turning point came when Karen agreed to accompany David to one of the youth mentorship programs he was involved in. The program aimed to help young Black and Latino kids from disadvantaged neighborhoods learn skills for success. At first, Karen felt out of place. Her designer clothes and polished demeanor starkly contrasted with the casual streetwise energy of the kids. But David made her feel welcome, gently guiding her into conversations and activities that made her feel connected. In one particularly heart-pounding moment, a group of young men from a nearby neighborhood, known for its gang activity, showed up at the program. There was tension in the air. Karen could feel it. These kids weren't here to mentor or be mentored. They were there to intimidate. David remained calm, but Karen was scared. The boys began taunting David, throwing racial slurs at him, mocking his success. Karen's heart raced. She could sense the danger in the air and feared it would escalate into violence. But David's calm never wavered. He spoke to them with patience, never raising his voice, and eventually the boys backed off. Later, when Karen asked how he remained so composed in the face of such hatred, David simply shrugged. "You can't fight hate with more hate," he said. "You just have to keep showing them there's another way." That moment stayed with Karen. It was the first time she truly understood what it meant to rise above prejudice, to not let anger or fear dictate her actions. But Karen's newfound sense of self was about to be tested in ways she couldn't have imagined. As she grew closer to David and became more involved in his work, she made enemies in unexpected places. Former friends and colleagues started spreading rumors about her. She received threatening messages online, accusing her of betraying her race and social class. Then, one night, Karen found herself in real danger. Walking home from an event, she noticed a group of men following her. Panic set in. She picked up her pace, her heart racing as the men closed in behind her. Just as they reached her, a hand grabbed her shoulder, pulling her into a dark alley. Karen's fear was palpable, her breath shallow as the men surrounded her. But then, out of nowhere, David appeared. He had followed her home after the event, sensing something wasn't right. In a tense, heart-pounding scene, David confronted the men, diffusing the situation with a mix of calm authority and strength. Karen, shaken but unharmed, realized that this was her ultimate test. She had seen firsthand how ugly the world could be, but she had also seen how grace, strength, and kindness could overcome even the darkest moments. In the days that followed, Karen took her transformation public. She began speaking out about her past prejudices, using her platform to raise awareness about systemic racism and inequality. The backlash was fierce. Her former social circles cut ties with her completely, and her name became a target for online hate. But Karen didn't back down. With David by her side, she continued to push forward, using her newfound understanding of empathy and kindness to make real change. In a final, emotional scene, Karen approached David and offered a sincere apology for how she had treated him in the beginning. "I don't know why you helped me," she said, tears in her eyes. "But you've changed my life in ways I can never repay." David smiled softly. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said, echoing his words from their first encounter. "I did it because it was the right thing to do, and that's all that matters." The story ends on a hopeful note. Karen has redeemed herself, not just in David's eyes, but in her own. She has let go of the prejudices that once defined her and has embraced a life of kindness and empathy. And, as she walks beside David, she knows that her journey is far from over, but it's a path she is proud to walk. Karen's journey wasn't over, but she had taken the hardest steps. Every morning felt different now, lighter, purposeful. She no longer feared the whispers behind her back or the side glances from people who once admired her. Her focus had shifted entirely, from how the world perceived her to how she could make a positive impact in the world. David, always her quiet support, had become more than just a mentor. He was a true friend, and in many ways her guiding light through the turbulence of her personal transformation. The once unthinkable friendship between them had deepened into a bond built on mutual respect, shared values, and a desire to break the chains of prejudice, not just in Karen's life, but in the lives of everyone they touched. Karen had started her own initiative, a program that brought young women from her old social circle into David's mentorship efforts. The goal was to expose them to the realities of the world beyond the privileged bubble they lived in, to teach them empathy, and to dismantle the biases they carried, just as Karen had done. One afternoon, as Karen and David were planning the next event for their joint initiative, Karen found herself opening up to David about her past more than she ever had. "You know," she began, hesitating for a moment, "I used to think the world was simple, that people like me were just better. I didn't even question it." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "But after everything, I see how wrong I was, and I'm still learning." David gave her a reassuring smile. "It's not about where you start, Karen. It's about where you end up, and you've already come a long way." Karen smiled, but before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at it, and her expression darkened. It was a message from one of her former friends, a vicious comment accusing her of abandoning her roots and mocking her efforts to make a difference. For a moment, the weight of the criticism threatened to pull her down. The insecurities, the fear of being judged, and the temptation to fall back into her old ways loomed large. But then she looked at David, who gave her an encouraging nod, and something inside her shifted. "I'm not going back," she said aloud, more to herself than anyone else. "I'm not that person anymore." Karen knew that in order to fully move forward, she had to confront the remnants of her past, both the people and the prejudices she had left behind. One of her most significant challenges was reconnecting with her estranged family, who had always fostered the very biases she now worked so hard to dismantle. Her parents, especially her father, had been furious when she first started working with David. They saw it as a betrayal of everything they stood for, a rejection of their privileged lifestyle and the legacy they believed in. Karen hadn't spoken to them in months, but she knew that she couldn't leave things unresolved forever. One weekend, she made the drive to their estate, the towering gates and manicured lawns a stark reminder of the life she had once clung to. Her heart pounded in her chest as she knocked on the front door, not sure what kind of reception she would receive. Her father answered, his expression cold and unwelcoming. "Karen," he said, his voice laced with disapproval, "what brings you here?" Karen took a deep breath. "I'm here to talk, to explain why I've made the choices I've made." The conversation was tense, filled with accusations and defensive retorts. Her father refused to see things from her perspective, dismissing her transformation as a phase. But Karen stood her ground, refusing to let the old feelings of inadequacy and fear take over. She explained how meeting David had changed her, how his kindness had shown her the flaws in the way she had been raised, and how she could no longer turn a blind eye to the injustices in the world. Her father scoffed. "You've been brainwashed, Karen. This man, David, or whatever his name is, has manipulated you." But Karen shook her head. "No, Dad. He opened my eyes. And I'm sorry that you can't see it, but I can't keep living the way I used to. I want to make a difference." Her father's face hardened. "You've turned your back on your family." Karen felt a wave of sadness, but also a sense of resolve. "No, Dad. I've turned my back on hate." With that, she walked out of the house, knowing that the rift between them might never fully heal, but she also knew that she had chosen the right path. Just as Karen began to feel more secure in her new life, a dark threat emerged from the shadows. A group of powerful individuals from her old social circle, threatened by her growing influence and her partnership with David, conspired against her. They couldn't stand the idea that one of their own had turned against the system they thrived in. Karen started receiving anonymous threats, messages warning her to back off from her work with David, to stop pushing for social change. The messages were ominous and filled with hate. David, concerned for her safety, urged her to be careful, but Karen refused to be intimidated. One night, while leaving a fundraiser for one of their initiatives, Karen's car was vandalized. Spray-painted slurs covered the windows, and the tires had been slashed. The message was clear: someone wanted her to stop. But instead of cowering in fear, Karen became more determined. She contacted the authorities, but more importantly, she and David began increasing security for their events and programs. The suspense built as the threats escalated, creating a tense atmosphere that loomed over their work. The tension reached a boiling point when Karen received a chilling message. "We're watching you. You can't hide." The weight of the threat was real, and for the first time Karen felt the genuine danger that came with standing up for something bigger than herself. Despite the growing danger, Karen and David refused to back down. They rallied their supporters and doubled down on their efforts to promote equality and understanding. Karen, now fully immersed in her new life, gave public speeches, wrote articles, and worked tirelessly alongside David to push their initiatives forward. One day, while speaking at a community event, Karen felt a surge of emotion as she looked out into the crowd. She saw young women who reminded her of her former self, privileged, sheltered, and unaware of the world beyond their bubble. But she also saw hope in their eyes, a desire to learn and change, just as she had. David stood beside her as she spoke, his presence a constant reminder of the kindness that had changed her life. In that moment, Karen realized that the journey she had started was far from over, but she was no longer afraid. She had faced her past, confronted her demons, and found a purpose greater than herself. The threats, the dangers, and the challenges still loomed, but Karen knew she wasn't alone. With David and their growing movement behind her, she was ready to face whatever came next. In the years that followed, Karen and David's partnership blossomed into something even greater than they had imagined. Their initiatives grew, reaching more communities, changing more lives, and challenging the systems that had kept so many people oppressed for so long. Karen became a symbol of redemption, her story inspiring countless others to examine their own prejudices and biases. She had transformed from a woman consumed by privilege and prejudice to someone who fought for equality and justice. David's quiet strength remained at the core of their work, his influence spreading far beyond the community programs they had started. Together, they built a legacy of kindness, showing the world that even the smallest acts of compassion could change lives. As Karen looked back on her journey, she realized that paying for her meal was just the beginning. It wasn't about the money, it was about the ripple effect of kindness, how one act of grace could lead to a lifetime of change. In the end, the threats and challenges they faced only made them stronger, and Karen knew that the work they had started would continue long after they were gone. Together, they had shown the world that love and understanding could conquer even the deepest divides. Karen woke up one morning to the news splashed all over the internet. A smear campaign had been launched against her. A popular media outlet, backed by individuals from her former social circle, had published a scathing article accusing her of hypocrisy and insincerity. They dredged up old photos and statements from her past, painting her as a fraud who was only using her newfound social justice work to mask her privileged upbringing. The headlines screamed betrayal and lies. Karen's phone buzzed incessantly with calls, texts, and emails. Her public image was under attack, and this time it was coming from powerful people who had the resources to drag her name through the mud. For a moment, Karen felt a crushing wave of doubt. She wondered if this was her punishment for the life she had once lived, for the blind privilege she had reveled in. But, just as that doubt began to consume her, David called. "It's all noise," David said calmly. "They're scared because you're making a difference. This means you're doing something right." His words gave her the strength she needed. Karen knew that this was a test, one last attempt to pull her back into the life she had left behind. But she wasn't that person anymore. She had come too far to be broken by lies and smear tactics. Together, Karen and David held a press conference. With poise and grace, Karen faced the media. She didn't deny her past, nor did she make excuses for the person she had once been. Instead, she owned her mistakes, admitting the biases she had once held and speaking openly about her journey to unlearn them. "I'm not perfect," she said, looking straight into the cameras. "I made mistakes, and I hurt people along the way, but the difference between who I was then and who I am now is that I've learned, I've grown, and I'm committed to continuing that growth, no matter how hard it gets." Her vulnerability resonated with people. Instead of being dragged down by the accusations, Karen's honesty elevated her. The smear campaign backfired, and soon the conversation shifted from her past to the importance of acknowledging and overcoming privilege. The storm passed, and Karen stood stronger than ever. With the media frenzy behind her, Karen and David threw themselves back into their work. Their initiatives expanded, reaching new communities and attracting more supporters than they ever imagined. Donations poured in from all over the country, and their programs began making a tangible difference in the lives of the people they served. Karen had fully stepped into her new role as a leader. No longer was she the woman who hid behind privilege and prejudice. She had become an advocate, a voice for the voiceless, and someone who was unafraid to challenge the status quo. One of their most successful projects was a mentorship program for young women from privileged backgrounds, much like Karen had been. The goal was to help these young women confront their biases, learn about the realities of systemic inequality, and use their privilege to help others instead of perpetuating the cycle of discrimination. The program was a resounding success. Karen saw pieces of her former self in these girls, arrogant, naive, and sheltered. But just as she had learned, they too were capable of change. Many of them went on to become activists, entrepreneurs, and philanthropists, using their influence to make a difference in the world. It was a full-circle moment for Karen, and as she watched these young women flourish, she knew that she had finally found her purpose. Just when it seemed that everything was falling into place, a new and dangerous obstacle emerged. The threats that Karen had been receiving began to escalate. Anonymous letters arrived at her office, each one more sinister than the last. Someone was determined to stop her from continuing her work. David, ever the protector, insisted on increased security, but Karen was reluctant. "I won't be scared into silence," she said firmly. "We can't let them win by giving in to fear." But the danger was real. One evening, as Karen left an event, her car was run off the road by a black SUV. She swerved to avoid it, crashing into a barrier. Thankfully, she wasn't hurt, but the message was clear. Someone wanted her gone. David rushed to the hospital where Karen was being checked for injuries. The sight of her lying in the hospital bed shook him more than he let on. For the first time, he showed his vulnerability, sitting by her side, holding her hand, and telling her how much he admired her strength. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. "We're in this together." Karen nodded, realizing that she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the people who believed in her, for the movement they had built, and for the future they wanted to create. The near-death experience didn't stop Karen, but it made her realize that the people behind the threats weren't going to stop until they were confronted. With David by her side, Karen decided to go after the people who had been targeting her. They hired a private investigator to track down the source of the threats, and it didn't take long for the truth to come to light. The attacks were being orchestrated by a group of powerful individuals from her old social circle, people who had once been her friends. They saw Karen's success as a threat to their way of life and were willing to do whatever it took to stop her. In a tense and heart-pounding confrontation, Karen and David met with the group's ringleader, Jessica, an old friend of Karen's who had turned against her. Jessica admitted that she had orchestrated the attacks because she believed Karen had betrayed their social class and was using her platform to destroy everything they stood for. "You were one of us," Jessica spat. "And now you're pretending to be something you're not." Karen, calm and composed, responded with quiet strength. "I'm not pretending, Jessica. I've changed, and you can't stop me from doing what's right." The confrontation ended without violence, but the threat was neutralized. Karen had faced down her past and stood victorious. Years later, Karen sat at a celebration event for the foundation she and David had built together. The crowd was filled with people whose lives had been touched by their work. Young women who had been mentored, disadvantaged communities that had been uplifted, and countless others who had been inspired by their story. As Karen looked around the room, she felt a deep sense of pride. She had come so far from the person she used to be, and she knew that the work they had started would continue long after she was gone. David stood beside her, as he always had, his quiet strength the foundation of everything they had accomplished together. In her closing speech, Karen spoke about the power of kindness and redemption. She told the audience that the ripple effect of one small act of kindness could change the world, just as David's simple act of paying for her meal had changed her life forever. "We all have the power to make a difference," she said. "We just have to choose to do it." As the crowd erupted in applause, Karen looked at David, and he smiled back at her. Their legacy was set, a legacy built on kindness, on the courage to change, and on the belief that love could conquer even the deepest divides. Despite their many victories, one final hurdle lay ahead for Karen and David. The government was planning to cut funding for social programs that had been lifelines for the very communities they served. The stakes had never been higher, and Karen knew that if they didn't act quickly, years of progress could be undone. Karen and David organized a massive campaign to fight back. They rallied supporters, held town halls, and lobbied politicians to keep the programs running. It was a tense, exhausting process, filled with moments of doubt and frustration. The opposition was powerful, well-funded, and determined to see the programs end. On the eve of the final vote, Karen gave a speech at the state capitol. Her voice rang with conviction as she shared the stories of the lives they had touched. The single mothers who had found jobs, the young men who had turned away from crime, and the communities that had been transformed. "We can't go backward," Karen urged the crowd. "We've come too far to stop now. These programs aren't just numbers on a budget sheet. They're people's lives. They are hope." The vote came the next day, and in a narrow victory, the programs were saved. It was a bittersweet moment. Karen and David had won, but they knew the fight was never really over. There would always be another challenge, another obstacle. But they were ready. Years passed and Karen's life had settled into a peaceful rhythm. She and David continued their work, though they had begun to step back, allowing a new generation of leaders to carry the torch. One afternoon, while sitting in a cafe, Karen received a message from someone unexpected: Jessica. The woman who had once been her friend and later her enemy had reached out, seeking reconciliation. Karen hesitated, but something told her that this was another opportunity for growth, for both of them. They met in the same cafe where their lives had once intersected so sharply. Jessica, no longer filled with the venom of their last encounter, looked different, older, humbled, and perhaps a little lost. "I was wrong," Jessica admitted, her voice small but sincere. "I didn't understand what you were trying to do. I thought you were betraying us, but now I see it was never about that." Karen nodded, feeling no need for anger or resentment. "It's never too late to change," she said softly. "I know that better than anyone." They spoke for a while, not as enemies, but as two people who had once shared a bond, and while their friendship could never be what it once was, Karen felt a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. Years passed and Karen's life had settled into a peaceful rhythm. She and David continued their work, though they had begun to step back, allowing a new generation of leaders to carry the torch. One afternoon, while sitting in a cafe, Karen received a message from someone unexpected: Jessica. The woman who had once been her friend and later her enemy had reached out, seeking reconciliation. Karen hesitated, but something told her that this was another opportunity for growth, for both of them. They met in the same cafe where their lives had once intersected so sharply. Jessica, no longer filled with the venom of their last encounter, looked different, older, humbled, and perhaps a little lost. "I was wrong," Jessica admitted, her voice small but sincere. "I didn't understand what you were trying to do. I thought you were betraying us, but now I see it was never about that." Karen nodded, feeling no need for anger or resentment. "It's never too late to change," she said softly. "I know that better than anyone." They spoke for a while, not as enemies, but as two people who had once shared a bond. And while their friendship could never be what it once was, Karen felt a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. As Karen and David reached the twilight of their careers, their focus shifted from day-to-day operations to ensuring the longevity of their programs. They established endowments, partnered with universities, and passed on their knowledge to the next generation of leaders. Their foundation had grown beyond their wildest dreams, with chapters in cities across the country and even international branches. What had started as one man's act of kindness had turned into a global movement of empathy, empowerment, and social change. Karen often reflected on the journey that had brought her here, the prejudices she had shed, the threats she had faced, and the love she had found in both David and in her mission. The woman she had once been was a distant memory, replaced by someone who had discovered the power of redemption, the strength of kindness, and the peace that came with knowing she had made a difference. One night, as Karen and David sat on the porch of their country home, watching the sunset, Karen turned to him and smiled. "Do you ever wonder how different things would have been if you hadn't paid for my meal that day?" she asked. David chuckled softly. "I didn't do it for thanks, remember? I did it because it was the right thing to do." Karen nodded. "It was, and because of that, we changed the world." David smiled, squeezing her hand. "We did, and it's just the beginning." Karen's journey is a testament to the transformative power of kindness, empathy, and personal growth. Her life changed because of one small act of grace, but it was her courage to confront her past and embrace a new way of thinking that truly defined her legacy. Alongside David, Karen proved that it's never too late to change, to right wrongs, and to build a future rooted in compassion. The story of Karen and David is not just about personal redemption. It's a call to all of us to examine our own biases, to challenge the systems that perpetuate inequality, and to recognize the power we have to make a difference in the lives of others. Thank you for watching this incredible journey of transformation. If Karen's story moved you, if it made you think, and if it inspired you to create change in your own life, then hit the like button and share this video with your friends. We'll see you in the next video.